Welcome to this presentation about some of the most exciting lighting features soon available in Unity 2021.2. In the next 30 minutes, I will give you an overview of the brand new volumetric cloud system offered by the high-definition render pipeline, as well as some of the alternatives that have been available so far to generate beautiful clouds in Unity, including the HDRI distortions and the cloud layer system. We will have a deep dive into the volumetric cloud presets and their properties. We will see how you can customize their look very quickly to create jaw-dropping visuals. Then, I will focus on the new lens flare system, which works with both the universal and the high-definition render pipeline. We'll see how you can download a library of presets, add them to any game objects, and customize their look using the many transformation parameters available. I'll end the session with the light anchors, a system that lets you massively cut the time needed to place lights around a subject thanks to the predefined light rigs and handy controls. My name is Pierre-Yves Donzala. I'm a technical art manager at Unity. I specialize in lighting, rendering, UX design, and artist workflows. For several years, I've worked in the game industry on a number of titles as a lighting artist, on franchises such as Crysis, GTA, and Red Dead Redemption. During this time, I produced the lighting for many types of projects and designed several systems to light and manage large 3D worlds and cutscenes. Let's get started with the volumetric clouds. Traditionally, CG projects have been using images, or HDRIs, to simulate the sky and the clouds, especially in scenes where the camera remains static or on the ground level. When they are based on photos, these distance clouds can look very realistic, while being very cheap to render. However, because they are always rendered infinitely far away from the camera, you might experience some disconnection between the sky and your environment. Also, they need a very high resolution to look convincing, which can add several hundred megabytes of memory consumption. On top of it all, you need to carefully adjust the exposure as well as the intensity and position of the sun for each HDRI. To combat the very static results you get with HDRIs, we've added the ability to distort the sky with a scrolling effect. This can radically boost the visual quality and add a lot of dynamism to the world. Also, we've recently added cloud layers in HDRP. These allow you to render up to 8 layers of clouds in front of your sky. And like most HDRP effects, these are controlled via the volume system. So let's add an override for cloud layers and look at some of their most useful parameters. Of course, you can tune the global opacity of the cloud layers. And like for the HDRI sky, you can introduce a procedural distortion to simulate the wind. You can easily control the speed and the direction of the distortion. They can even receive some rudimentary lighting as well as cast shadows onto the environment. The latter is especially improving the connection between the sky and the terrain. Finally, you can control the influence of every cloud layer up to 4 per texture. This way you can create beautiful transition between different types of clouds. The cloud layers are a quick and easy way to add dynamism to your skybox, and for lower-end platforms and simple projects, it's a fantastic way to create dynamic skies and time-of-day transitions on the cheap. However, this system still relies on a flat, distant skybox, so the clouds don't really have a physical presence in the environment, and there is no sense of depth between each layer. Volumetric clouds, on the other hand, have a perceivable thickness, and they can interact with the wind, cast believable shadows on the environment, and contribute to the volumetric lighting and fog. Obviously, the drawback is that the rendering cost of volumetric clouds is higher than the one needed to display a simple HDRI. This is why volumetric clouds are still fairly rare in video games and are mostly seen in consoles and PC games. However, our system is highly optimized and it relies a lot on temporal accumulation. In simple terms, it means that we use the results of previous frames to shade the clouds, because the amount of resources required to calculate everything in a single frame is relatively high. At the moment, these volumetric clouds are only available with the high-definition render pipeline, or HDRP for short. It is the pipeline of choice if you are targeting high-end platforms and physically based rendering. So let's turn off the cloud layers and switch the sky to the physically based one, which simulates the atmosphere of the Earth and reacts to the sunlight. Actually, if I were to zoom out by several thousand miles, you can see that the whole atmosphere is truly simulated. Of course, it reacts to the direct sunlight. But before we add volumetric clouds, I'll need to make sure the project is set up correctly. Let's head to the project settings, and in the global settings for HDRP, I need to make sure the cameras can render the clouds by default. Then, for my current HDRP asset, let's make sure the volumetric clouds are actually turned on. In most cases, if I don't see the clouds, those two checkboxes are most likely the cause of your problem. Now let's activate the clouds. Let's add a volumetric cloud override. By the way, you might want to show all the additional properties in case you don't see them on your machine. Let's also move the overrides at the top of the stack for convenience. Let's enable them and turn on the cloud shadows as well. And voila, you've done most of the work and have beautiful volumetric clouds with realistic shading in your scene. The technique we used is a ray march volume with 3D noise to generate the shapes and the erosion. Rays are traced from the camera towards the clouds, and whenever they hit a valid part of the cloud volume, a secondary ray marching towards the sun will occur. By the way, I recommend you enable temporal anti-aliasing when working in a scene view, and make sure the always refresh mode is on, especially if you are dealing with clouds moved by the wind. By default, the clouds are not local. This means you are not able to fly into them. Once the local mode is active, you can freely fly through them. When moving at extremely high speeds, you might see some sampling artifacts that produce some unwanted ghosting and noise. You can alleviate these by reducing the temporal accumulation and increasing the number of steps to combat the flickering. Indeed, the clouds rely on samples over multiple frames, so the less sample and less accumulation, the noisier the results will be. Increasing the samples will of course have an impact on the performance, so try to minimize them as much as possible. For most scenarios where the camera doesn't move at 1,000 miles per hour, you shouldn't really need to fiddle with these parameters. In the local cloud mode, it's also important to understand the impact of the far clip plane in the camera properties. In case you cannot see the clouds or they don't extend very far, it is because your camera far plane isn't high enough. Obviously, pushing this far plane very far can have a negative impact on the performance and rendering precision. This is why not using the local mode is recommended for most situations when the camera doesn't need to be inside the clouds. In this mode, the clouds will behave more like an HDRI, so you will never be able to reach them, but they will still receive the same great lighting and cast shadows onto the environment, and this mode will be less prone to artifacts as well. So we provide three main control modes for the volumetric clouds. Simple, which is great if you want to get quick and good-looking results with very little tuning required. We'll focus the rest of this section on this mode. Advanced will let you define the location of up to 3 predefined cloud types, and Manual, which is the most complex mode to understand, will get you even more control by creating your own cloud lookup table and cloud coverage maps. In the simple mode, you'll find presets for sparse, cloudy, overcast, and stormy. These are the 4 quickest ways to get a given type of weather in your scene. There is even a curve-based custom mode that lets you have even more control, but we'll get to this one a bit later. So the look of the clouds and their impact on the environment is driven by many factors: the overall shape and type of clouds, the wind, the lighting, and the shadows that we just enabled. Let's have a look at some of the most important parameters in each section. First are the shape offsets. These two are very useful if you need to place your clouds or their shadows very precisely. For instance, for screenshots or a specific vista. Then you can override the curvature of the cloud dome. By default, it mimics the curvature of the Earth. If you have a smaller world or want to force the clouds to collide earlier with the environment, you can increase the curvature. It's more obvious if we zoom out. Curving the cloud dome slightly will also let you use a lower far distance plane for the camera, which is potentially a great optimization tip if you want to use the local mode for the clouds. Then of course, you can change how thick the cloud cover is. You first set the bottom altitude of the cloud volume and then its thickness. It's all in meters and very straightforward. By changing the altitude range of the provided presets slightly, you can create an infinite amount of variations, and you can transform thick stormy clouds into thin wispy clouds and vice versa. Next are the wind parameters. In real life, clouds move between 0 and 300 km per hour. For the sake of this demo, I'll use 3000, that's almost thrice the speed of sound. You can see that even at these speeds, the system remains perfectly stable. Previously, I mentioned that there are two types of 3D noises used for the clouds, one for their global shapes and one for their erosion. You can actually control the speed of these two noises independently. This way you can create an effect of buoyancy to give more dynamism to the clouds. If you keep a similar speed for both noises, the whole cloud volume will move in a very rigid, non-organic way. This is why using a slightly different speed for both noises will give you the best results. Now let's have a look at the lighting settings. You can easily control the darkness of the clouds by controlling the level of ambient light affecting them. You can also introduce additional visual definition into the cloud by playing with the erosion occlusion. Then you can change their color by overriding their scattering tint. This can be very useful to emphasize the color of the clouds during certain times of day, like a sunset. However, this isn't particularly physically correct, and you should try to keep the tint black for more correct results. Finally, you can adjust the light scattering inside the clouds. For instance, the powder effect will let you tune the backscattering effect, and it can be used to add some powderiness to the clouds. Whereas the multi-scattering is used to tune the forward scattering, and it can be used to emphasize the strength of the lighting, or minimize some of the burning that may happen on the edges of the clouds. Now that we've looked at the most important parameters for the predefined cloud presets, let's dive into the simple custom mode. It lets you control the look of the cloud with 3 additional curves. It's definitely my favorite mode, and it's certainly the best way to understand how the tech works and experiment with it. First, we have the global density multiplier to control the thickness of the volume. Values between 20 and 50% usually give the best results. Then I'll tune the very important density curve. The horizontal axis represents the normalized altitude range, and the vertical axis represents the density. Let's lower all those keyframes, and as you can see, I have now reduced the density for the whole altitude range, and this results in smaller clouds being rendered. Then let's reintroduce some density in the upper atmosphere. This creates larger clouds near the top of the cloud volume. To add more clouds at the bottom, I'll create a keyframe and put it up. I now end up with 2 distinct cloud layers. If I want to connect both layers to create a single layer of taller clouds, I just need to lift this middle keyframe to fill the gap between both layers. As you can see, this system is incredibly powerful, and you can experiment with one single curve. In a matter of seconds, I can create totally different cloudscapes. Again, the system relies on 2 noise textures that basically eat at the cloud. The first one is called shape noise, and it's used to give a very rough shape to the clouds. You can control how large these shapes are with the shape factor, and specify how repetitive the pattern of the cloud will be with the shape scale. The second noise is called erosion, and it is used to create micro details on the surface of the clouds. If you zero the erosion, the clouds will look like very large blobs. As I increase the value, you can see that micro details appear on their surface. Finally, you can change the scale of the erosion noise. Low value will give a reduced level of micro details, whereas higher values will bring more details. You will need to find a compromise between micro details and repetitiveness. Of course, we also give you a curve to control the erosion per altitude level. This gives you a very fine vertical control on the micro shaping applied to the clouds. Last but not least, the ambient occlusion curve lets you simulate darker rain clouds, for instance, by controlling the amount of light occlusion happening within the clouds. You can already create an infinite number of cloudscapes with just a handful of sliders and curves, or simply rely on the base presets to get a given weather condition in no time. Many more features will be added in the future to improve the quality and the usability of the system. We wanted this system to be very flexible, serving both beginners as well as very advanced users. If you are the latter, have a look at the documentation for the manual mode by just clicking on the help icon in the volume override. This will help you understand how the different channels of the lookup tables and cloud coverage map can influence the look and position of the clouds. The next feature I'm going to present is lens flares. Lens flares are artifacts that appear usually when a bright light is shined into the lens of a camera. A lens is usually made of several pieces of glass, and the inner reflections between all these elements can cause troubles, going from the strong glare surrounding highlights to very sharp colored polygonal or circular patterns that match the aperture of the lens. In practice, lens flares are often unwanted because they are considered parasite visuals, but they can also be used as an artistic effect or as a narrative element. Solar lens flares usually go a long way to promote a sense of strength in the lighting, and they can be used to attract the attention of the viewer or the player. First, let's download the lens flare samples that we prepared for you. They are a great starting point. Head to the Package Manager, and under High Definition Render Pipeline, import the lens flare samples. After a couple of seconds, you'll be ready to assign them to your lens flare component. Let's add a flare to our directional light, and make sure you add the SRP flare. Then let's assign a flare asset, and I'm good to go. The sample library we provide has a wide range of flares you can use and tune for your own project. Let's just stick to the polycount flare, as it's a great showcase of all the features we provide. First off, you can control the global intensity and scale of all the sub-elements inside the flare. We'll look into how we can define these sub-elements in a minute. If you need the flares to interact with physical objects in the world and be correctly occluded, then you will need to enable the occlusion system manually. Additionally, you can force a flare to render off-screen. This is especially useful to create side flares from light sources outside the camera field of view. Obviously, you need to be very careful when enabling this checkbox, because the occlusion system only works in screen space. In other words, this means the off-screen feature is mostly useful for fixed camera shots, and it isn't really suited for gameplay where the player can move the camera easily. Now let's check the content of this lens flare asset. You can see this flare is made of a list of sub-elements. A thumbnail helps you preview each element, and you can easily disable them for quick iteration and debugging. A flare element can be an image, a procedural circle, or a polygon with an arbitrary number of sides. Let's tune the sunstar element. You can easily swap its image for another texture provided in this sample. You can tint this particular element. You can then also choose to have it tinted by the light game object. This is particularly useful if you have a generic lens flare that need to inherit the color of each light it is assigned to. In the transform section, you can add an offset in screen space, rotate, and also scale the element on each axis. You can then apply transformation along the axis that passes through the center of the screen and add an angular offset. Finally, you can duplicate the elements automatically and change their distribution along the axis. You can even use a curve to change their position to get fine control over the position of every single clone. You can use the same mechanism to control the scale of each clone as well. You can even apply a color gradient to them. Now let's look at a more practical scenario with a lens flare assigned to a lamp. I'll assign a lens flare to one of the lamp prefabs, and I'll pick the smartphone smudge preset. Now that we're dealing with a spotlight that has an actual position in the world, rather than a directional light whose light source is infinitely far away, I have access to a few more controls. An important feature when using a flare assigned to a spotlight is the light attenuation shape. What it does is forcing the flare to only render when the camera is within the cone angle of the spotlight. This is incredibly useful to avoid unwanted flares that aren't directly facing the camera, and this can offer a great workaround whenever the occlusion system isn't up to the task. For this demonstration, however, I'll disable this feature to force the flare to be rendered regardless of the camera position. By default, flares will render up to 100 meters away from the camera. In this case, let's reduce the distance to a more reasonable value of 10 meters. I can change how flares are faded with a dedicated curve. As I move the camera, you can see that the flares are appearing within 10 meters, following the attenuation curve I provided. Then you can use the exact same mechanism to control their size based on their distance from the camera. This is very useful when you do not want distant flares to cover the screen too much. By default, the flares will maintain their full intensity until they reach the edge of the screen. This might be a more realistic behavior. However, it might be jarring in certain situations when you do not want any visual pop. We provide a curve to let you smoothly fade the flare based on its distance from the edge of the frame. With the smoother curve I create, the flares disappear smoothly as they are about to leave the frame. By the way, if you want to take advantage of the off-screen flares, you will need to ensure that the attenuation curve does not fully curl the flare at the edge of the screen. As you can see, the lens flare system for URP and HDRP is incredibly extensive, yet very easy to control for both fixed camera and interactive scenarios. And thanks to all these features, you can replicate most lens flare phenomena seen in the real world. Or you can let your imagination run wild and create very stylized effects to embellish your scenes. Finally, let's see how you can use the light anchor system component to light your cutscenes or product shots very quickly. For this scene, I'm using the HDRP scene template. Note that the light anchor system also works with the universal render pipeline. First, let's drop our character in the third room of the template. I'm using the Sicarius character from the Unity Asset Store, by the way. Now, let's add a camera. You can easily align the camera to the scene view with the Align with View menu item. I'll now detach the game view so that you can get a great overview of what is happening. First, you must tag this cutscene camera as the main camera. This will help the light anchor system to understand which camera is used as a reference point for the placement of the lights. By the way, I'd recommend you activate temporal anti-aliasing on the camera to ensure you don't have any jagged edges or specular aliasing. When talking about cinematic lighting, depth of field is very important to simulate a real camera lens and to ensure that the background is not in focus, so that it doesn't compete visually with our character. So let's add this effect via the volume system. Let's set the volume to local so that it doesn't pollute my scene view or other cameras in the scene. Let's set it to use the physical camera system, including the focus point. Let's also make sure we stick to the highest possible quality for this shot. Of course, I also need to make sure my camera is set to the physical mode to ensure it works exactly like a real-world camera and lens combo. Let's adjust the focal length of the lens to 70 mm, like a typical portrait lens, and then readjust the framing slightly. To maximize the defocused area behind the character, I'll keep the aperture at the lowest f number possible for this example. I'll then adjust the focus distance to make sure that the eyes of the characters are in focus. By the way, the depth of field in HDRP is physically based, so you can easily alter the look of the bokeh, that's the area that is not in focus, by changing the blade count, the barrel clipping, as well as the anamorphism to reach a more cinematic look. Now that the subject is finally framed, you can see it looks incredibly flat. So let's add a spotlight and activate high-resolution shadows for maximum self-shadowing quality. The component we'll add to control the position of the light is called Light Anchor. Now I'll snap the light to the face of the character using vertex snapping. Hold V while dragging the light. At this point, the light is going to use the head of the character as its anchor point. Then, let's increase the distance between the light and the anchor point by simply dragging the slider. There is no need anymore to move the light manually in the scene view. The light intensity is too high, so let's reduce the amount of lumen the light produces. Any professional lighter will be pleased to see that HDRP supports most standard light units, that is lumen, candela, lux, and EVs. We also have a physically based workflow for color temperature in Kelvin with the ability to attach a color filter or gel to the light. To try different looks, you can switch between the presets we provide. For this scene, I'll want to have a key light coming from the top right corner. So let's use the corresponding preset as a starting point. Then, to fine-tune the position of the light, I can change the orbit angle with the dedicated wheel. Same for the elevation of the light. Now, to improve the silhouette of the character, let's clone our key light and transform it into a rim light coming from the left, thanks to the dedicated preset. For this rim light, or kicker, I'm going to raise the color temperature to end up with a slightly colder light, to add some color contrast, and increase the intensity by 2/3 of a stop. To add more rim to the hood of the character, I will raise the elevation slightly and adjust the orbit a little. Because of the physical shading, the Fresnel effect on this light looks fairly strong and the bloom starts to kick in. So I'll dim it by roughly 2 stops down to about 9 EV. Let's add another rim on the right side, but this time with a warmer color temperature and a more subtle intensity. Some of the shadows are still too deep inside the hood, so I'll yet again duplicate one of the spotlights, assign a bottom right corner preset, tone down the intensity slightly, and voila! I've now lit this character in about a minute to a decent level of quality without leaving the game view. So let's compare the result before and after. Without this light anchor system, I would probably still be fiddling with the very first light, trying to place it manually in the scene, constantly having to adjust the rotation of the light as well. So there's no saying that if you deal with cutscene lighting regularly, and don't want to constantly switch between the scene and the game view, you will love this tool. For the finishing touch, let's add a couple of sci-fi anamorphic flares. I'll just add an empty game object and attach a lens flare to it. I could either place it on a bulb, or I could make use of the off-screen feature to add a bit more structure to the image without adding too many highlights to distract from the character. Let's duplicate it and add another one on the opposite side of the character. It's all very quick and dirty, but hopefully you can get the point about how you can very quickly add lights to your subject, and optionally lens flares, to increase the visual quality of your cutscenes, screenshots, project showcase, and so on. And we finally reached the end of this session. I really hope you've enjoyed this introduction to some of the new exciting features available in the beta version of Unity 2021.2. The final release is expected by the end of the year, so this means you will probably get additional polishing and bug fixes for the features I've just showcased. If you want to experiment with the volumetric clouds and the lens flares, why not download the Unity Hub? It will help you manage all your Unity projects, learn about Unity with fun microgames and tutorials. Of course, you can also use it to download the latest official and pre-release versions of Unity. So create a new project using one of the templates and have fun with all these new lighting features. Again, thank you for watching, and if you liked what you just watched, please let us know. Take care and see you in the next video.